First, on Wednesday night, the Lowy Institute media lecture was delivered by ABC Chair Kim Williams. The tenor of this lecture is to discuss the connection between journalism and Australia's place in the world. The content of Williams' speech sounded like benign and obvious common sense to me, with the caveat that the walk means more than the talk. But in the context of the bonkers world we live in, and depending on your view of that world, it could have been considered as elite leftist propaganda or a right-wing Zionist conspiracy. The joys of the widening Overton window. In his speech, Williams spoke of the importance of trustworthy news and how the truth really matters.
My address today is on the vital importance of trustworthy news and coverage about international affairs. It has a simple theme: the truth matters. And I mean really matters, especially right now. One can't approach this subject without reference to undoubtedly the deepest thinker of the last 100 years on the relationship between politics and the truth, George Orwell. Orwell famously served in the Spanish Civil War and noted how while in Spain he continuously read news stories about things that quite obviously never actually happened. Small skirmishes he participated in involving a few dozen soldiers were written up as huge battles, complete with tanks and aircraft. People he knew to be loyal were denounced as traitors and accused of conspiracy to betray the Republic. He himself was denounced as a fascist, all of it pure invention, made up by propagandists to suit the needs of fascists, communists and others. Famously, he described this trend towards inventing facts for political ends as frightening because, and I quote, "It often gives me the feeling that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world."
Pertinent way to kick things off. And who better to be a historical reference than George Orwell, the genius author of the dystopian novel 1984, which warned us all of the Ministry of Truth. It was interesting him speaking about populist demagogues, the communists and the fascists, and how they use news to broadcast what they think should have happened according to the politics of the day. And while he opined that fascists and communists were the worst, he said they were not alone. And I think that is probably right. People may not carry those precise monikers or fit neatly in those boxes, but they can carry those tendencies and will attempt to exercise power where there's a failure to protect freedom of speech, where political expediency takes priority over objective truth. Williams went on to speak about news broadcasts during World War II and how the BBC was considered the least censored and the most trustworthy news.
The BBC, the truth, reliable facts, trust, these things went together along with freedom and still do. The story of the BBC in World War II tells us something. Freedom and the truth go together, and when truth is absent, tyranny is never far away.
Absolutely right, and are the good old days. A far cry from a headline this week where the BBC allegedly told the director of the Nova Massacre film We Will Dance Again not to describe Hamas as terrorists. What should they have been described as? Freedom fighters? Pastry chefs? Like the ABC, the BBC is the shadow of its former self, and one can only rely on a glorious legacy for so long. Anyway, Williams went on. He spoke about how a strong media led by people who believe in professional journalistic ethics is one of our most important democratic assets. Yep, agreed, no objection from me. And that misinformation has become politics by another means, and disinformation has become war by another means. Interesting analysis, more on that with my panel. And then he said this.
The task for people like me is to create more opportunities for you three and your journalistic colleagues to investigate, inform and report. It's my intention as the chair of the ABC with my colleagues on the board of the ABC to do just that.
I, like many others, live in eternal hope. And then towards the back end of his speech, he made two following comments. First, this.
Australia has an interest and a duty as an affluent, democratic and former imperialist nation in our region to do all we can to promote a thriving democratic media and counter the spread of misinformation, disinformation and censorship.
And a bit later this.
And it's why everyone who cares about Australian, regional and global democracy, no matter what news organisation they work for, must also fight to ensure George Orwell's nightmare vision of a world in which objective truth cannot survive does not come true.
Objective truth. Ironically, words like misinformation and disinformation are often bandied around in order to conceal objective truth. And that's the issue. It's a suppressive, ill-conceived solution to a problem which can be better remedied by more openness, more ideas and, frankly, a lot less government. Overall, William's speech, it hit the right notes. It told me everything I wanted to hear. But as I said earlier, the walk is more important than the talk. And my gratuitous advice to Kim Williams, in the immortal words of Limp Bizkit, don't write cheques, your ass can't cash. Joining me on the show this week is 6PR radio host Oliver Peterson and the Australian's Darren Davidson. Darren, what were your overall thoughts on the speech? And misinformation, is it the new politics and disinformation the new war?
I think no one would really disagree with the argument that Kim Williams put forward. The timing is very unfortunate. The ABC appears to have just been caught red-handed tampering with video footage to amplify false charges against former SAS platoon leader Heston Russell. So Kim himself in the speech acknowledged that there's an ongoing investigation into that. I think the thing that a lot of people would take issue with is the fact that one, the ABC has argued that they've withdrawn the video, but management has argued that the reporters involved in the story were not actually involved in the doctoring of the footage, which I think is a very hard position to argue given the high personal stake those reporters have in the story. They should be across the brief. They should know what's going into the video and be across the editing process as part of that package, that story. And I think the second thing is that Kim and others tend to position all of this as being part of a culture war, when in fact it's really just shoddy journalism. And that goes all the way to the top, and people should be held accountable for that. Lots of media outlets make mistakes. It's an unfortunate part of the process from time to time. But the ABC's got a fortunate track record of making a lot of these big, high-profile mistakes lately.
And Ollie, hard to argue with a lot of things in that speech. But, the ABC is quite the staff-run collective. Does Williams have the opportunity or the ability to actually hold his own organisation to the fundamentals that he's talking about?
Well, he's come out of the blocks, hasn't he, Caro, since he's been the chair. And, as you mentioned before, you can talk the talk, but now he's got to walk the walk with this. And as Darren just said, the timing of this with the Heston Russell example is just a terrible time for Kim Williams to be doing this speech. But you know what? It sends a shot across the bow to all the journalists at the ABC that they have been put on notice. And Kim has not been backward in coming forward since he's been in the position. He's been talking about the impartiality, the requirements under the Charter for what ABC journalists must adhere to in their coverage of whatever it is. So, look, I think he's obviously ruffling a few feathers. He's going to be upsetting a lot of the rank and file, and particularly those journalists at the ABC who have been there for decades. But he's got a task, he's got a job to do. And I think this is probably what a lot of Australia has actually been crying out for in the leadership of the ABC. And obviously he's making changes. He's got a new managing director coming in. The news division is on notice. The Heston Russell example, though, it is just beggars belief that this could ever go to air. The fact that stuff came into the lawyers and was not passed on, what's going on in the processes there, and that fundamentally the team has been let down, but the buck stops with the producer of the program, the reporter of the program. They're going through a warts and all process through October, and it is, yes, embarrassing, but something that we want to hold to higher standards, obviously, in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And
perhaps something like this happening kind of also sends a bit of a shot across the bow to the staff.
Absolutely.
Because, it's framing what his leadership intends to look like so that we don't have issues like this cropping up. So I think while it's unfortunate, it's probably equally a very good one example that we wish never happened,
Yeah.
but a very good example of what happens when you don't hit those notes.
Yeah, it does. And I think, we all operate in this 24/7 cycle. We all operate, obviously, in a social media cycle now as well, where every single thing everybody says is scrutinised, whether you work in the commercial or the public media. And I know that, when we get into the disinformation bill and the like, it is a minefield for everybody to navigate at the moment, and every particular contributor or stakeholder within our industry, Caro, is under more scrutiny than they probably ever have been.
Absolutely.